campaign. Now, a cognitive war is essentially what the weak-sided and asymmetrical war has to fight in order to get the more powerful side not to use its strength. Normally, asymmetrical wars are about guerrillas from the Maccabees to the Viet Cong, which means that they're designed to chase out people who are far from home, imperialists as it were. What we're looking at right now is a cognitive war which is being conducted as an offensive. That is to say, not only are the people who are conducting it invading the culture that they want to stand down from resisting them, but alas, they are doing very well at it. I would say that in the last 15 years, the West has almost systematically lost in this cognitive war, and it starts on October 1st, 2000, in France, which was the beginning of the wave of anti-Semitism and I call it Jew hatred as a medievalist. That starts in 2000 and continues growing stronger to this day. On October 6th in the streets of Paris, people were yelling death to the Jews for the first time since the Holocaust in the streets of a European capital. The reporters who were there didn't comment on it. It was only through eyewitness testimony subsequently that anybody heard about it. This summer during this summer's Gaza campaign in 2014, death to the Jews was heard all throughout European capitals, and many Europeans were saying, where does this come from, even though for the last 15 years it's been on the rise. So there's, and incidentally, that incident in Paris at the synagogue on Rue des Roquettes, which was only saved again by people standing in the breach, actually began with 3 hours of shouting death to Jews in Place de la Bastille during an anti-Israel demonstration. So BDS represents one of the major fronts in this cognitive war. The goal is to destroy Israel. Just like the goal of many of these riots in Europe is to chase Jews out of Europe. And in both cases, the destruction of Israel and the chasing of Jews out of Europe will, if they succeed, result in an enormous weakening of people who don't think that they're necessarily stakeholders. One of the reasons why the Europeans ignored the stuff about Jews until it happened to connect with the attack on French cartoonists was that they really believed that this attack on the Jews was specifically on the Jews, and in a funny way they deserved it. Not so funny. They deserved it, and so there was no sense of solidarity. Nobody was paying attention to Bonhoeffer's remark about first they came for the Jews, and then they came for me. Similarly, on campus, people have been led to believe that Israel deserves this. But in fact, what's happening on campuses as well as at the UN, as well as in human rights organizations around the world, like Amnesty International, which just decided that it didn't have any bandwidth for dealing with anti-Semitism, formally decided that it had no bandwidth for that. These organizations get corrupted by a politicization which is weaponized, and that's all part of this cognitive war. So it's in that frame that I would like to address the issue that Alan raised earlier about left and right. Because something really remarkable has happened in the course of the last 15 years. As Alex has shown, the preparation for it had gone on for quite a while, but at a certain moment, and I would date it to 2000, there is a flip in which what had previously been an almost entirely marginal voice all of a sudden came pounding into the public sphere and was received with either enthusiasm or the kind of cowardice that Alan was referring to about tenured professors. I refer to it as the crumbling of the cultural Maginot Line. And it happened first in France and by and large in Europe. And it is now, I think I probably agree with your 5-year lag, it is now hitting America. And part of, or in fact one of the essential elements elements of that has been the absolutely stunning flip in which people who identify themselves as left are anti-Israel and pro-Palestinian. This represents an absolutely staggering inversion of the moral universe. There is no country that is more progressive, certainly in the Middle East, than Israel, and I will take Alan's point that, you know, any country under the kind of pressures that Israel is under would not, any other country would not have behaved as well. I mean, it took the French exactly 3.5 years to go from a glorious revolution to the terror. And they did that, and the excuse that historians give for them doing that is, well, you understand, they were under pressure, the threats from the outside to the revolution made them paranoid, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so they did. And the Soviets were worse, and the Cambodians were even worse. And it's been a long history of leftist egalitarian revolutions that when they take over and they feel under threat, they turn not only against their enemies, but they turn against their internal enemies and become totalitarian societies. So in that sense, the fact that Israel has gone 67 years without turning into a totalitarian society actually represents the most extraordinary record for egalitarian revolutions. And consider one more thing, which is that it's not the party or the revolution that's being threatened by outside forces. It's the extermination of the people. And this gets us to a separate issue, which is, why aren't people more aware that there is daily genocidal incitement in the Palestinian public sphere? Why has the New York Times not informed people? Why is it that after the lynch of the journalists in October 12th, 2000, in Ramallah, a speech was given the next day that was broadcast on Palestinian TV, in which the imam called for, his lines were exactly, labor Likud, they're all Jews, they're all the same. And then he went on, kill them wherever you see them, have no mercy, kill them, kill their friends, like the United States, etc. And the journalist who was writing for the New York Times about incitement, because the Israelis were saying, look, what's going on in the Palestinian territories is like what happened in Rwanda. You have radio stations that are literally calling for genocide. And here's an example. And the journalist who was quoting the story and who did a perfectly even-handed affair about he said, she said, quoted this as saying, labor Likud, they're all Jews, they're all the same, ... close quote. And to this day, the New York Times has never done anything on this, even though I won't go into the details. So the issue becomes, what happened? And what happened that the left, as Alan said, it is a litmus test of the left today to be anti-Israel. How did this come about? How could, I mean, I understand some of it. I understand, and this is true of journalists as well. I understand that you can have some advocacy journalists like Robert Fisk and so on, but how is it that across the boards we have this attitude? And particularly, you know, being an Israeli now and spending time there, and my daughter was in Dovel Tzahal, the IDF spokesman's unit, I got to understand that even the journalists who come to Israel who have every intention of being even-handed, within weeks get socialized into an anti-Israel attitude. And having done some reporting and gone with journalists on various expeditions to the northern border, et cetera, talked with them, they are completely imbued with this notion that the Palestinians are the underdog and that the Israelis are the cruel oppressors. Now, again, I can understand even 20–25% of independent minds, but we're dealing with a herd, not independent minds. And so the question is, why is it, how did it happen this way? As a medievalist who specializes in apocalyptic and millennial ideas, one of the ways I formulated it is that somehow, over the course of the last 15 years, the radical left, not the soft left, but the soft left's been drawn into the force field here. the radical left has essentially adopted the jihadi Dajjal. And for those of you who don't know what the Dajjal is, it's their version of the Antichrist. It is in Muslim apocalyptic scenarios, the Antichrist, the enemy at the end of time, is known as the Dajjal. And for a long time, Israel has been the Dajjal in the Muslim apocalyptic imagination. And for some real wackos in the sort of radical Trotskyite left, that also has been the case. But now all of a sudden it comes to the fore, and in all the anti-war rallies, 2003 and so on, when I have a PowerPoint, I show this amazing poster that was up, which was, you know, swastika sign, American flag, Israeli Star of David, and $ for capitalism. And that's the Antichrist. So how did this happen? How did you get to the point where in the really radical circles, Israel is the source of all evil. In the less radical sources, Israel is unser Unglück, our misfortune, in which in somehow, you know, as, who was it who got the letter saying, it's, you know, yeah, but what, oh yeah, you got it. What about Netanyahu? And then Israel is passing up all these opportunities for peace. So, in other words, the instinct is every time something goes wrong, it's Israel's fault. And if only Israel would be nicer. And this is a widespread attitude on the left. I just heard Jeremy Ben-Ami speak. There's no question in my mind that this is what drives his approach to the issue. So the question becomes, what happened here? And I'd like to pick up something Alex said about the Kairos document and supersessionism. I think that we are looking at a secular version of supersessionism, which is to say that the supersessionist believes that, in the Christian case, with the Christians, the first supersessionists, their attitude was, we are the new Israel, we are the true children of God, and since this is a zero-sum game, the Jews have to be unchosen. And our moral rectitude and the truth of our revelation to our saving revelation to the world depends on the Jews being excluded from God's covenant. So we replace them, and supersessionism comes from to sit on top of. We sit on top. We are above, and you are below. And you are below because we are above, and because we are above, you must be below. So there's this sort of invidious quality, zero-sum quality to this thinking in which I only feel good about myself when I can feel bad about you. And I think that what's happened on the left is precisely this kind of supersessionism in which you have a kind of, a friend of mine put it, a friend, I guess he's a friend, said to me repeatedly during the beginning of the Intifada, this time Israel has lost the moral high ground. This time Israel has lost the moral, and I'm trying to think, you know, how do you lose the moral high ground to people who teach their kids to blow themselves up among civilians? What do you mean by this? And I realized it was just terribly important for him to believe that somehow Israel had lost the moral high ground. And as a result, I came up with a formula which may sound pretentious, but I think there's a kind of moral schadenfreude going on here, which is that you take pleasure in the moral degradation of Israel. And I think that's got a lot to do with the kind of journalism we get, this sort of absolute obsession with everything Israel does wrong. I like the headline that Alan read. You know, that headline is not nearly as satisfying to at least some people than a headline that says, you know, terrorists attack police and Israeli police kill 2. That you don't have that sort of lovely taste of, oh, you Jews, 2,000 years you were oppressed by other people, and now you turn around and do it to somebody else. And the sadistic version of this is, let's call it sadistic schadenfreude, which is, you're as bad as the Nazis. No, as Gilad Atzmon would love to say, we're worse than the Nazis, or you're worse than the Nazis. So in that sense, I think that, let me just read you a statement that was read, that was made by a man named Jostein Gaarder, who is a very famous public intellectual in Norway, a big popular figure amongst various, he's a science writer, he's a popular science writer, very popular. And as a result of not what the Israelis did in Lebanon, but how the media covered what was done in Lebanon, he wrote this. And this is just a small fraction of what was really a rant. There are limits to our patience, and there are limits to our tolerance. Note the royal we. We do not believe in divine promises as justification for occupation and apartheid. We have left the Middle Ages behind. We laugh uneasily at those who still believe that a god of flora and fauna and galaxies has selected one people in particular as his favorite and given it funny stone tablets, burning bushes, and a license to kill. Now what's interesting here is Israel's fighting war with Hezbollah, which not only believes that they're the chosen people of God, but they not only have a license to kill, they have a command to kill. That doesn't bother him. He's not upset by jihadi supersession or the sense of chosenness. He's upset by Jewish sense of chosenness. And that royal we, I think he's speaking for a sort of collective voice of what Judith Butler calls the global progressive left, and into which he embraced the arrival of Hamas and Hezbollah right after this same Lebanon event, because they're anti-imperialists. So you really have a kind of moral disorientation on the left that can't be better expressed than in Judith Butler saying that we welcome Hamas and Hezbollah into the global progressive left because they're anti-imperialist. Why are they anti-imperialist? Because they're against American imperialism. The fact that they're the most ferocious imperialists on the planet doesn't even register. Now you can't make a more fundamental error than embracing somebody who wants to exercise their imperial sovereignty over you as fellow combatants in a war against imperialism. In fact, that's what the... I won't go there. Okay, so let me conclude.
2 minutes.
2 minutes. 2 minutes.
Q&A.
Okay. So
we're already late on time.
right. So one of the things I'd like to say is that when Sam Huntington wrote The Clash of Civilizations, he was roundly denounced by people for being a warmonger, for, now that the Soviets were gone, we need an enemy. Only with an enemy can we know what we're doing, and therefore, pick anybody and start going after them to make enemies. And as a result, when the enemy that he had designated, which was the jihadis, started to attack us, particularly in 9/11, the attitude was that, first of all, one attitude was, what did we do to make them hate us so? And what you end up with is an attitude that says people who warn against jihad are the enemy, and they're the ones who are the warmongers, and this has happened with